Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us at our webinar today entitled Building a Concurrent Enrollment Teacher Pipeline, Opportunities, and you know what? Here, I better double check that I get this right. Challenges and lessons. You would think by now I would know all that, but indeed I do not. Well, actually I know it deeply. I'm joined, my name is Jenny Parks. I'm the VP for Policy and Research at MEC, the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, and I am joined today in this presentation by my collaborators on this paper, Amy Williams, the Executive Director of the National Alliance for Concurrent Enrollment Partnerships, also known as NACEP, Alex Perry, the coordinator for the College and the High School Alliance, and of course the lead author on the paper, Jennifer Zinth, founder and principal of Zinth Consulting. So I want to remind everyone that we are recording this, and this recording will be posted in multiple places, not the least of which is the MEC website, possibly as soon as tomorrow. We're not going to have any slides today. This is really a discussion to really unpack and explain the paper. We're anticipating a lot of questions. I will ask you please to not put your questions in the chat. Please put it in the Q&A. That way we can keep comments and questions and things of that nature separate. And we will be looking at those and trying to answer them in real time and saving some time for the end for another Q&A session as well. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can let you know. I think we're good. This has been a labor of love. It's taken over a year. We've seen collaborations among not only all of our organizations, but from representatives from many organizations and institutions around the nation. This took about a year of meetings and discussions for us to really answer the question, okay, we know that there's a pipeline and a teacher supply crisis in general, but in particular, we are concerned about concurrent enrollment teachers who meet the credential expectations for HLC and actually some of the other regional accreditors as well, and of course for NACEP. So this is a very complex problem, and if you just begin to pull one thread, a bunch of others unravel. So we tried really hard in this paper to take care of all of those and kind of reweave them back into some type of tapestry that was understandable. So I am going to now turn it over to Jennifer Zinth, who is going to facilitate the conversation among all of us. I will note that there is a link to the paper in the chat. Thank you, Mary. Mary Robertson from MEC is also joining us today, lending us some technical support. So Jennifer.
All right, thanks, Jenny. Thanks you all for joining us today. So we have a handful of questions that the panelists will be touching on, but as Jenny mentioned, we invite you to share your questions for the panelists in the Q&A function. And so first question we have is, why this paper and why now? Alex, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking some of your time on a busy Wednesday, and also taking some time to read the report. We know it's a fairly comprehensive and chunky document, and might take you a little while to get through. I think there's a few reasons why now for this issue, one of which is it's clearly on the minds of many dual enrollment practitioners across the nation, right? Obviously, this is, I would say, a bigger issue in states in which the majority are exclusively the institutions of higher education are accredited either by the Higher Learning Commission or SACS, because those accreditors have specific now requirements around dual enrollment teacher credentialing. But I think, you know, one of the things that I've been really surprised by as part of this process is that it's not just kind of policymakers and practitioners in HLC or SACS states who are interested in these issues, but also many of our colleagues from other states as well. You know, from the HLC perspective, I think why now? Well, the answer is there's a deadline coming up, and it's now only a year away, within which HLC has said that for dual enrollment programs, they need to be using teachers who have the appropriate credentials that HLC has laid out. That's 18. It's either a master's degree in the discipline specific area that the teacher is serving as the instructor for, or 18 credit hours in that discipline specific content area. But really, I think part of the other reason for doing this now is because there's actually been a lot of work that's happened across the country on this specific set of issues. I think led by a lot of our partners in states like Indiana, Minnesota, Ohio, but lots of other states too that have really kind of sat down and started to think about, okay, how do we address this credentialing challenge, right? We don't have enough teachers with graduate credentials to teach these courses. What's it going to take us to get there? And by virtue of now having a number of really interesting and innovative strategies that either individual institutions of higher education, systems of higher education, that whole states have adopted in order to address this, there's lots of great work happening in various different places, and we kind of wanted to take the opportunity to pull all of that together, provide the most updated set of ideas and thinking around, like, okay, how do you do this? Because it's not just a short-term challenge, right? It's not just about addressing how do we get within the next 12 months a set of teachers who are credentialed in order to meet those HLC guidelines. I think longer term, and this is something we spent a bit of time thinking about in the paper too, is like, okay, what does it look like in order to maybe think about some changes to the teacher preparation system such that you're not trying to get mid-career professionals to want to go back and take some additional graduate coursework. So I think, number one, that kind of short-term need to really kind of provide the latest and best thinking on best practices around how to do this. But two, also start some of those conversations, which we know, again, also happening in the States around, long-term, what does some of the changes that we need to do here look like? And what are some of those changes? And how do we go about starting those conversations in order to build a better pipeline for instructors?
Thanks, Alex. And Jenny, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we've been working on this since the clarified expectations in the policy language came out in 2015 from HLC. And we've done a number of things because all 12 MEC states fall within the HLC region. It really did seem like as the regional compacts, as far as the regional compacts go, we're kind of HLC central. So we did immediately start having conversations with HLC, and I have to say they have been fantastic partners in this process. They have been so responsive and so open and included us on so many conversations. Particularly, I feel like nothing happens in this area of teacher credentialing and concurrent enrollment teacher credentialing from their perspective that they don't also make sure that I know and that I can then share it with my stakeholders and my colleagues. So that's a shout out that I think is important to say. And it's been there from the very beginning. So that's important. We've been doing research, gathering data across our states early on just to see, well, how big a problem is it and where? And there's been, as Alex said, there's been enough progress and change over the last few years that we are in that 18-month window now. We're in the countdown to September 1st, 2023. Which is when all of the extensions for programs to meet these guidelines expires. And so we are now into that critical zone. Many of the questions that we are asking, and we'll be collecting more data this spring on how many teachers still need credentialing, what areas do they need it in, how much do they need, how many credit hours, and what do we need to do to help them get there. So we're going to be trying a number of ways. If you see some surveys or if you've got some ideas, some contacts, please contact us. Let us know. We want to know how to deploy these questionnaires and these surveys and get that information. We want to be able to share it as broadly as possible so that we really do have a comprehensive view of the scale and the scope of this issue. We also know there are a couple of things. I'll be very honest, at MEC, we're finally to the point where we've got an online portal that we want to share with the region and the nation, where we are inviting institutions to put online the graduate courses they have developed for this purpose, or even some that they just feel would be relevant and appropriate for teachers. It's called Graduate Credit Quest. Thank you, Mary. She's placed a link in the chat for us again. That is a great place where we are hoping we can bring people together to find some of the courses online that they need, even if they're not in their own state or at their local university. And again, we're trying to make that a space where this particular issue can have a lot of currency, a lot of discussion, and a lot of resources. Because as you all well know, this is not the type of thing that lives in the same place in every state or in every institution. And so we kind of need this emergency management system right here in this final 18 months. And we're going to try to help with that. Our friends in Minnesota also have something that they've done that's very similar, but is Minnesota centric, but also is a great thing to take a look at if you're interested in some of those courses offered there. So there are a lot of things happening right now, and we do feel like we're on this countdown that we've got to get a very comprehensive view of this out there so that it can be all hands on deck to address the issue.
Yeah, and I would just echo those elements. I think there is a time sensitivity that a lot of us that work and play in this space are really attentive to. And NACEP, for those of you that don't know, is an organization that really, the first and only national organization to support programs, practitioners, and policy. And so as we did the work on this paper and even running up to it and having early preliminary conversations, we very clearly saw that the solutions that were being developed and the people that were impacted fell into those three areas: programs, practitioners, and policy. So we're seeing some states work really hard on the policy side. We're seeing some institutions get really creative and innovative on kind of the programming side. And we're seeing a lot of practitioners really talk about this. It's a consistent topic of discussion on our at our annual conference. And we've gotten a lot of proposals through our call for proposal process over the years that really dig into this topic. And even that's coming from states that are outside of HLC as well. I remember very vividly being at, ironically, a NACEP conference in 2015, and I was representing a state agency, brought a whole team of coordinators with me. Two of them came running up to me and said, "What is HLC? It sounds like something big is happening." And so that was really my first foray into looking at how the impact of regional accreditors and changes they might make or clarifications they might make in their policy really trickles down through the program level to the practitioner level, and then often bubbles up in the policy space as well.
That's a really great segue to our next question, which is, what were some of the key takeaways from the project and the work on the paper? You talked about program, policy, and practitioners. Amy, what would you say else came out of this project as a key takeaway?
So I'm a systems girl, so I love to look at things from that big perspective, right? And kind of look at, how the big pieces are falling into place to support other areas, right? So I think the big takeaway that I had is there is a lot of work that's happening at multiple different levels. Some of this work has been really elaborately coordinated. Some of it is much more localized. So yes, people are working on this. Absolutely. No one is ignoring this deadline. So that was a key takeaway as well. Innovation was another key takeaway that we picked up on. There were a lot of, we'll get into it in a bit, but basically a lot of the efforts that we saw fell into basically three overlapping approaches. And there's a diagram in the publication showing this, but we saw the use of incentives. We saw the use of alignment of systems and alignment in initiatives. So a lot of very innovative, pragmatic solutions to tag on to other teacher pipeline approaches. A lot of innovation in the space of doing grants to support development of coursework and things like that. And so those things were not mutually exclusive either. A lot of times they engaged multiple different pieces of those three areas. And kind of echoing Alex's opening comments, I think one of my big takeaways was that, like in all things in our world, dual and concurrent enrollment, this is a very special niche in education, and it takes a lot of explaining to get there and get people to understand why this is an issue, what the particulars of the issues are, how they vary between gen ed faculty and more technical faculty. All of those things are kind of key points that really are important in doing this work. So as you work to do something about this impending deadline, there's a lot of communication, a lot of explaining, and a lot of goodwill building amongst stakeholders to get everybody on the same page before you even start to dig in.
And I think, one of the key takeaways I think I walked away with was this idea that nobody needs to start from scratch on this, from the perspective that it's not like you have to come up with the idea about how to do it and then go out in order to do it, right? Like there are definitely states, programs, we've highlighted a number of different examples in the report of policies, of individual institutional initiatives that are very replicable in your own circumstances, in your own states, and for which, then it's sort of, solving part of the problem, right? Which is, okay, well, what is the specific idea that we want to implement in order to address this? Obviously, you still have to then go out and make that happen, which is no small task in and of itself. But in terms of like looking at, what are the kind of basic ideas that can be used in order to address some of this challenge, whether that's on the incentive sides and the cost sides around how do you eliminate costs for mid-career professional teachers in order to take these courses? How do you design a graduate program for teachers that provides them these course opportunities at a time that works with the schedule of a full-time teacher? A lot of that work has already been done in a number of states and a number of institutions. And I think it's, you don't have to invent the wheel. It's merely just the case of like going out and finding somebody who's got a perfectly functioning one and figuring out how to kind of replicate that within your own state and circumstances. Same at the state policy level too, around things like, looking at state investments to eliminate those costs, maybe to provide a little bit on the incentive side. I think that's probably one of those areas where there's still work to be done in order to figure out how to advance. But I think certainly from that perspective of like, especially if you're, in a state or at an institution where this is not an issue that has kind of come significantly onto sort of the radar from a solutions oriented perspective, right around there is an active discussion taking place around how to fix the problem. You don't need to start from nothing, right? There are lots of examples and ideas within states at institutions that are already taking place, and I think that folks can really look at and say, okay, which of these different ideas is going to work for our specific institution, for our specific state, and then think about how to implement those. And I think also to pivot off of something that Amy said, which is critically important, is that, we do sort of have to continue to recognize that we are kind of a bit of a special snowflake in the education world, right? To the degree that, the needs of the dual enrollment community are a little bit unique and do require a certain level of norm setting, of socialization of exactly what this world is and how it functions with folks who do not necessarily sort of interact with these issues in the same way that the 123 of us who are on this call right now do that, right? I think particularly as we're looking at, right, so, I was sort of talking about cost and incentives, that's some of your short-term stuff. But when you're looking at questions around like, okay, how do you think about, potentially designing educator preparation programs to sort of build in a bit more discipline-specific content for teacher candidates so that they're taking care of getting those credits on the front end and then are never going to need to go back and take more graduate credits when they're mid-career professionals. A lot of that is like, it's going to take a lot of conversations with those educator preparation programs around what the needs of the community are and how they should be conceiving of the work that they do as part of the solution to this problem. I would venture a guess, and I think I'd be right about this based off of the dual enrollment teacher working group conversations, which we hosted last year, which I think many of the people on this call participated in, that like a lot of educator preparation programs are just not thinking about this issue at all, right? And not because it's not something that they would necessarily want to be helpful in terms of fixing, not because it's something that they've just decided they have no role to play. It's just because they don't know it's an issue and they don't know it's something that they could potentially help out in terms of fixing. And so I think, with a lot of this work that we do in the dual enrollment space, communication is, it's not 90% of the battle, but it certainly is a significant, important first step towards, if we actually want to fix something, we need to make sure that the other entities within the system that we want to be sort of doing things and behaving in a certain way are ultimately following through and doing that. And part of sort of solving that problem is just explaining and setting the expectations around what the path forward should look like. And hey, this is the problem, this is the issue. How can we partner together in terms of looking at solving it?
And I would just piggyback on that by saying that as I was preparing to think about this, I really thought, yeah, this is an issue that will only be addressed with collaborations and more communication and building understandings and some alliances that have not traditionally been there. So I can just list some of them, which is you now have K-12 and higher ed having to talk about things. I mean, that's always a conversation in the concurrent enrollment space, but this is a new piece of that. And those are maybe maybe those people are talking at universities now and colleges to each other about how do we go about fixing this. We also have to have public licensure, Department of Ed talking to the field and saying, well, yeah, maybe would licenses be structured differently? Because again, that's going to drive a lot of what's done in a teacher ed program. We have to have legislatures having conversations with departments of ed and higher ed, because I know we've had states where they heard about this. A well-meaning legislator will hear about this and say, oh, well, we'll just pass a law saying you don't have to do that. Well, that actually doesn't help. That actually makes it a little bit more unclear for folks, confusing, and now it has to be undone. So again, some conversations there, maybe bring in the accreditors. I mean, this is the first time actually that the K-12 community probably has even heard of regional accreditors, and they need now to understand, they get this constant question, well, aren't they for higher ed? What does that have to do with us? So if you think about all of the strange bedfellows, that was the term I had written down, that you have to have some really interesting conversations among folks who've never really had to have them before to address this. And that's the key takeaway for me, because I really feel like unless you've got that, it's not going to move forward.
Thanks, Jenny. And I would just kind of echo some of the comments that some of you all have made as I was researching and writing the report, that the two things really stuck out for me were so many moving parts. When you see programs like in Indiana or Pathway to 18 in Minnesota, it looks like, oh, this isn't that hard on the surface. And then you start talking to people and drilling down, and there are so many moving parts that people need to find solutions for in order for these programs to work. And then as you all commented on, there's a lot of persuading that has to go into making these programs work, because 4 institutions are being asked to credential high school teachers to teach mostly community college courses, and having to persuade them to see what the benefit is for them long-term in developing and offering these types of courses. So moving on to our next question, and again, I invite folks to ask our panelists to our questions to our panelists in the Q&A. But what's nobody solved yet? Jenny, you talked about the need for strategic conversations. What more should policymakers and practitioners be doing that they haven't done yet? Jenny, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks. So one of the things that, because I work at a regional level, at that level between states, and we do have a lot of conversations with MEC, with policymakers, because there are commissioners and of course just stakeholders. One of the big things that is kind of in the most ethereal level here is that there is this burgeoning demand for concurrent enrollment, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But the primary one being is we know there are tremendous positive outcomes for students, especially those from underrepresented and first generation backgrounds, where the likelihood that they will apply to college, matriculate, complete, et cetera, is greatly enhanced by participation in these sorts of programs, and in particular, the model that has them taking these courses in a high school classroom with a classroom teacher. So that is huge. We want, we've got the completion agendas that we want to get toward, and this we see this as a major lever to pull. So we've got this burgeoning demand, and it's like no one ever thought about, well, do we have anyone to teach it? And these are not good conversations to have by yourself or just theoretically. You really do have to, at some point, rationalize it. Yes, would I love for a ton of these courses to be available to students everywhere, especially those who are underserved, additionally, because they're in a rural or a distressed urban area? Can we get these courses to them? Well, only if we have the teachers. And so this is a piece that we've got to somehow figure out, because the less that we have conversations and ways to deal with this, the more unfair what we can do will be, the more haphazard it will be, and the less progress we can make systemically on incorporating this set of practices into American K-12 and higher ed. And so that is really the thing. I don't know, I haven't been able to figure that out, but we do need policymakers and government folks and practitioners all at the same table, figuring out how we're going to wrestle it a little bit and make it a less chaotic space.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so the thing that I kept noodling on, I guess is the appropriate word, is really, and this comes up in the paper, right? And we put it in the end, is really what are the correct types of experiences, educational coursework that makes a really good 100 and 200 level instructor. And this is something I keep coming back to more because I think that's the space where the long-term solution is going to live. And I think Jenny Parks was the one who teed this up. Basically, we're being asked to, or practitioners, institutions, states are being asked to basically retrofit a very well understood, very well established program and procedure for advancing as a high school instructor. So a lot of the approaches that we came across were really in this retrofitting space, but what was totally absent from a lot of the discussions, because they were really focused on the retrofit, was some of these long-term discussions of like, if we're talking about trying to really effectively prepare instructors at the 100 and 200 level, what do those experiences look like? And where's the research and the data on that? And so that's something I kept coming back to, particularly because I think it's an area that would add a lot of value. And part of this is that I come from a background from a state, the state of Montana has a very weird statute that requires, if a student is going to take a college course and request high school credit, that college faculty member actually has to be a K-12 licensed educator in the state. I think Montana is still the only state that has that. So I got a lot of two-way looks on that in terms of how to better prepare faculty to really understand the students that are coming in at 100 and 200 levels as well. And part of that was referenced on statutory requirements. Montana has a constitutional requirement that high school students and elementary K-12 students all have to learn about Indian education and understand the context and the peoples and the landscape that existed prior to westward migration. And so when you challenge a college physics professor to go through a licensure process and really understand how Indian education for all in our statute fits into their chemistry class, that can be kind of a challenging conversation, but it's a really important part of preparing for strong instruction in this kind of starting level. So, I went right to the big picture one, like, what haven't we figured out? What we really need to make outstanding instructors, whether they're concurrent enrollment or whether those introductory courses instruct.
Yeah, for me, there's an ultra long term and there's a short term one. And my ultra long term one is exactly the same as Amy's, right? Which is, I think we all sort of recognize that there's probably something that high school teachers need to do in order to demonstrate that they are in a position to teach a high quality college course in a high school environment. But I don't know, I genuinely don't know that the answer to that is 18 credit hours or a master's degree in the discipline specific area. And as much as we have tried to like push on that question and try and find out, what's the research base that underlines it, I don't know that a really solid one exists within a dual enrollment specific context that says that is the right that's the right threshold, right? Below 18 credit hours, red lights flashing, danger signs, warning signals about what, whether that teacher is in a position to deliver that high quality college content. Above that threshold, we feel perfectly fine. I mean, I think that the charge for, I would say, obviously there's charges coming out of this initiative for the policy community, for the practice community, but I think there's a really interesting charge for the research community as well, which is, help us understand what that is, right? Like, we are currently in the process of creating a system around an 18 credit hour threshold. I don't know that any of us feel all that confident is like the answer to the question. Now, I think personally, just my kind of like viewpoint on it, I'm sure everybody's going to come down in a different space just based off of their opinions and values about it. What is that right kind of threshold? What does that look like? But there are lots of different ways to conceive of what it could take for a high school teacher to teach that college course content well, right? Ranging from nothing to a master's degree in the discipline specific area. And I think we just don't know between those two extremes, where is that sweet spot, right? I mean, obviously we're doing a lot of work right now to kind of engineer a system that aligns with 18 credit hours, because that's the charge from the accreditors. And, they have not indicated a desire to change their mind on that. And as much as we continue to push on it, it's that is just a frustrating reality that we will all continue to have to deal with in the short term. But I think in the long run, if it's possible for us to create some kind of evidence-based sort of an evidence-based idea about what an alternative credentialing system could look like, where we can point to a set of research that says, well, if a teacher has this, whatever that is, but if they have this, that's going to put them in good stead around, and then, you know, we can feel a high degree of confidence around the quality of that course. Then I think you're going to start to see the field automatically move in that direction, because that is an evidence-based approach where I think the 18 credit hour threshold certainly is a historic approach. I don't know, though, from all of the conversations that we've had, it's necessarily one that's based on really solid evidence around dual enrollment teacher performance. That's the ultra long-term one, though, right? I mean, you know, just to get those research studies is probably going to take us 5 to 10 years. And we've got a lot of work to do over the next 5 to 10 years to make sure that we have enough teachers who are credentialed to teach these courses. I would say the other big kind of issue to look at, and you know, and things like micro-credentials, right, which I see a question in the chat and one in the Q&A, definitely a really interesting approach, right? But like right now, our sort of live in that same kind of space as the 18 credit hours. Do we know that's a successful strategy? Do we know that's something that, you know, can really kind of help a lot of teachers in this situation? I hope that there are researchers who are planning to look into that and pursue it further. But a lot of the kind of big picture alternate ideas for what an alternative to 18 credit hours are right now are based off of either, you know, what's easiest to do, what's possible to do in many places, but not yet really off of like, well, what does the evidence and the research tell us is the right approach to take? And I think that's one kind of framing I think it'd be really important for the field to adopt going forward. But that kind of, so that's the ultra long-term one. The short-term one, though, where I think even states that have done a lot of work and invested a lot of time and effort into this question already is really building out the incentives piece, right? There's a lot that states and institutions have done to reduce the costs to teachers for getting these credentials to nothing. But it's a whole other set of conversations around, okay, well, once you've reduced that cost to zero, you know, given teaching, especially now, is a high stress, demanding job that, you know, we're already asking a huge amount from so many high school teachers just to be high school teachers, that then we're saying, oh, and by the way, we'd like you to teach these dual enrollment courses. And in order to do that, we're going to need you to go and take some graduate courses of your own, right? Even reducing that cost proposition down to zero of, it's not going to cost you any money, or, you know, there's no financial hit to you to do this. And we're going to do everything possible to make this as sort of aligned to, you know, your schedule and every, right? You can do them all in the summer and not have to do them during the school year. I think there's still, though, and we're sort of seeing this in some of the states that have made it no cost, designed a system that's very teacher friendly, there's still a need to kind of to do something a bit more than that to advance, to create an incentive for teachers to actually want to be able to do that, right? I mean, some of the ideas, I think it's states like Maryland have in statute the ability for school districts to pay more to teachers who have those discipline-specific credentials that puts them in a position to be able to teach those courses. But there's definitely, I think, probably a bigger conversation that's necessary. But honestly, as part of that, and this is sort of where the dual enrollment teacher credentialing conversation sort of bumps up against some of the national teacher workforce conversations as a whole, right? Like, I think that's a small component of a very important conversation that needs to have around teacher compensation and what that looks like, and are we paying teachers enough generally, right? You know, irrespective of the dual enrollment piece, and looking at how do we make teaching an attractive career. Like, I've always thought that if we were to kind of, you know, think about blowing up the system and rebuilding it, that adding sort of a career step, which is, okay, you're a high school teacher and then you want to kind of step up from there and be a college instructor as well, that like that could be part of that sort of career ladder and career advancement for a professional teacher to whatever kind of endpoint they want their career to have. But we're not yet seeing in a lot of places kind of uptake of that, not just the kind of reducing the cost piece to zero, but then also expanding those incentives, so you're really getting the uptake from teachers who see an incentive for themselves in order to do this beyond just, teaching for the sake of teaching and teaching these courses for the sake of teaching these courses, of which we know many teachers are mission driven, passionate about the work they do. But given there are so many asks on time and commitments for teachers right now already, looking more at that incentives question, I think, is going to be a really important component of how do we build a longer term pipeline of having teachers in many more places who have the credentials we need in order to provide access to students.
Jennifer, if I could jump in and piggyback just for a moment. I think, another area that I keep thinking about is how do we make this normal? Like I know that Jenny Parks spent some time in the classroom. I spent time in the high school, middle school classroom as well. None of this ever came up in discussion about what is your professional advancement path. So I think, how do we make this a more normal behavior and really make it very clearly valuable for the instructors that are participating, intrinsically, like professionally valuable and, obviously financially valuable. So I think that's one area that it's not going to be probably as heavy a lift as trying to figure out like the ideal, set of courses or experiences needed. But it is kind of a paradigm shift in the understood, well established, very useful system of teacher professional development, career professional development.
Yeah, I had some thoughts relevant to what you all were saying. I mean, someone had asked about micro credentials, and we just talked about what are the different ways, or what does being ready to do this look like, and how do we know what that is, and then what are the paths? Because I do think it's not just an issue of what are your paths as an educator, because I do think giving people those choices, but those clear visions is going to really be very motivational. But it's also, even just for the short term, what are some alternative paths? So someone mentioned micro credentials, which would be packets of courses and experiences that allowed maybe for some testing of readiness or something. A lot of the conversations that we ended up having in the course of this work were like, what about credit for prior learning? What about demonstrating something that you already know or do? What about outcomes? Is there a way to measure student outcomes from your course? Can you compare those to one taught by a college faculty who is considered successful, and do you have comparable outcomes? There are a lot of different things that this could take the form of a demonstration of ability and readiness that would not necessarily be the 18 graduate credits. And I do think those are important things for us to consider and explore and keep offering. And I would say the bulk of the work done with this kind of mindset is happening in Minnesota. So I encourage you to take a look at Pathway to 18 and some of the support materials they've got, because they are really working on finding these different ways to get there. And I know a lot of people are interested, well, what about CTE fields? Well, in career and technical ed, that really can vary highly depending on state policy and regulations. But that's another place where a certain number of practice hours and maybe some certain licenses and certifications, and then some tested experiences. Again, maybe this is just something where there is an exercise that you can gain admittance to this for a year, 3 years, whatever it is. And so those are some things we would like folks to be thinking about and, getting back to us on, maybe developing those models. Another thing that occurred to me as we were talking about this is it's a two-way street. I think one of the reasons that there's such a huge impact on students' trajectory and success of those 100 and 200 level courses is because that is that foundational general knowledge. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the last 2 years of high school in Europe. It is the capstone of a lot of the stuff intellectually that you've been preparing for since you were in kindergarten or preschool. And as that gets solidified, and we kind of know from developmental brain studies, that's a really important time. It's not just important to be a master of your subject area. This is where the teachers are coming in to say, okay, yeah, I can take more chemistry, but do you really know how to write a good learning assessment? Do you really know how to have a great Socratic conversation and really figure out who can demonstrate an understanding verbally or in a written form? And this issue of andragogy, pedagogy, lesson design, instructional design, evaluation, that again, I love my faculty folks with whom I work, but they will tell you, never got trained in any of this. Well, learning is an art and a science, and there are things they can learn. So again, is part of this the fact that you are learning this material from someone who knows teaching really well and knows developmental psychology of late adolescence, et cetera. And one more piece I think that we need to really noodle on and think about is, and it's in no particular order here, but it comes up in this same area. I know that as folks are trying to develop the courses that they're offering to high school teachers, just offering them the courses you would normally have in a master's degree program in one of these, in an area, is often not what they need. They don't just need these random accumulations of courses. They need something that really speaks to the ability to teach 100 and 200 level courses. And they might not have been, I mean, I like to use my math folks as an example. They can be a perfectly good math teacher. And they might not teach anything beyond college algebra, that classic gatekeeper course. But you can't, why do they need like linear algebra or theoretical numbers or all these things? They don't. And so how do you develop something that is on point for them? And how do you have a conversation with the faculty? Because I do know there's a lot of faculty anxiety about how does this diminish our field? How does this diminish our program? If you let people in, but they only take 18 credits, then they look like a non-completer. How does that affect our funding and our statistics? There are a lot of pieces there. Those are the conversations, again, that I think you need your departments, your dean of the graduate school, and the School of Ed, and folks from the community all getting in there to say, what are we trying to do here? And it's just letting them know the value of concurrent enrollment, just like we didn't hear too much about a lot of these things when we were teaching high school, Amy. I venture to say there are a lot of faculty who really don't think or haven't had too much experience with concurrent enrollment and some of these minutiae. So again, more conversations are needed.
And I think that is a really great and salient point, right? Especially in this particular moment in time, right? I think, you know, over the last couple of years, we have sort of seen, particularly amongst a lot of post-secondary faculty in a lot of states, a sense of growing concern about dual enrollment. You know, what does this mean for my, you know, job? What does this mean for, you know, the long-term existence of 100 and 200 level courses taught in the college? And, you know, I think some of those concerns are fair to the extent that the dual enrollment community has not sort of yet articulated the extent to which kind of like, what is the end game for dual enrollment for many students in many circumstances. But I think, you know, in this specific moment, one of the things I've been reflecting on is, well, I mean, you know, we are seeing, unfortunately, significant decreases in post-secondary enrollment anyway as a consequence of the pandemic, right? There's been this breakage between the link that we hope would exist for many students between high school graduation and post-secondary matriculation into some level of program to provide some level of post-secondary degree or credential. And I think, you know, dual enrollment, as much as, you know, this field has traditionally been one, you know, going all the way back and still has the stigma associated with it of being, you know, gifted and talented, accelerated learning, right, advanced coursework. I hate all of those terms because they imply that this is a special something that is only for a very small population of students, when we know that all of the research shows that there are a lot of students, right? Maybe not every student, but there are a lot of students who are going to derive a significant amount of value from participating in these courses, both for their ability to access college and for their ability to complete college. And in a world in which there has been a breakage in that link between students, you know, are taking high school, they graduate from high school, our expectation is they will then kind of start take some kind of post-secondary experience, and they don't, right? One of the tools in the toolbox, and of course it's one of the tools in the toolbox, and it's very complicated, all the reasons why students are not currently kind of ultimately going on to college. I don't want to make it seem like it's simple and dual enrollment is 100% the answer. But in this world in which we're seeing significant declines in post-secondary enrollment and basically static enrollment in dual enrollment, if you look at the National Student Clearinghouse numbers around dual enrollment participation over the last 3-4 semesters, either slightly up each semester, maybe very slightly down, or static, where we've seen for pretty much the rest of the higher ed system, it's universally down. that this is one of the tools in the toolbox, particularly if you're bringing those college course experiences into the high school, to use as a mechanism to help get students back on that college going pathway, right? To expose them to the value proposition that post-secondary holds for many of these students, and get them started on that path towards doing it while in the high school, and not have college be that sort of scary thing that's over the other side of town that, for all of the many complex reasons that students are not ultimately going there. And that all rests upon the need to have a credentialed workforce. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is, in some ways, in my mind, there is this sort of growing narrative, which is not dual enrollment as threat to higher education. It is dual enrollment as not savior of higher education, because I think that's far too bold of a proposition to make, but dual enrollment as part of a solution to a serious set of challenges that higher education as a whole is facing, in terms of how do we re-weld that link together for many students, so they're making that transition between secondary and post-secondary and putting students on that college going path. And I think in framed like that, a lot of these teacher credentialing initiatives are not about looking at how to are not about threatening the jobs of college professors, are not about moving it from higher cost institutions of higher education into lower cost high school environments. They're about thinking about how are we getting students back onto a college going track at all, so that they do end up at an institution of higher education and they are getting some kind of post-secondary degree or credential when they get there. And I think with a lot of that framing, it starts to kind of make you rethink the necessity of this work, in that it becomes even more urgent, it becomes even more necessary to follow through and make sure we're providing these opportunities to students in the way that they need it.
Thank you, Alex. I love the idea of having a body of empirical evidence to determine what credentials or qualifications, skills a teacher needs to teach a college course. And Alex, I remember one of your comments during one of our working group meetings last year. What if the only teacher credentialed to teach college English is actually the worst teacher in the high school? Like, how's that doing right by kids to have that person be teaching this college course? About 15 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to some of our next questions. And the next one is on any surprises or unexpected discoveries that we found as we worked on this project. Amy, can you kick us off?
No surprises, no discoveries. We knew it all. We saw everything, right? No, I think one of the things I kept circling back on, and one of the reasons why this became such, I want to say like a labor of love in a lot of ways, but was because there's a lot being written right now about teacher pipeline issues and teacher shortages. And some of them are really bringing some more thoughtful empirical work. And so I think that puts us in a space where, there is nothing like a crunch time to get people's attention, right? So I think we're in a place where some of these conversations can be thoughtfully had. Whereas I think a decade ago, they weren't happening because we weren't dealing with the same types of pressures. Add on top of that, the pandemic elements, add on top of that, aging out and retirements. And so we're looking at a kind of a multi-prong recruitment issue, retention, and also representation, right? This is a predominantly female, predominantly white female teaching is in that space, very dominant. And so how do we work to increase equity within this, considering that concurrent enrollment instructors are basically a pool within a pool of instructors that are now contracting and also are obviously less diverse than what we need for students in the classroom. So I think really tagging on to some of these initiatives and seeing how it nicely fit with some of the conversations we were trying to derive was a pleasant, unexpected surprise.
For me, it was as someone who works in the Midwest, as my primary focus, I was amazed at how many people outside the Midwest and outside the HLC region were very concerned about this and thinking about this. And again, they're going to have a different set of motivations. I mean, they align with each other, but the immediacy of their needs is different. But I didn't realize there was such a widely spread audience for these types of conversations, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm hoping that we can collaborate to provide even more solutions nationwide, not just region-wide.
And obviously in this topic particularly, it's easy to focus on the scale of the challenge and the negatives. So I'm going to try and like take a positive framing in answer to this question. It actually ties into one of the questions in the Q&A that Ben, you asked around. I think it's a really interesting one, right? And it sort of came through in the working group discussions, and it's one that I've been thinking about, which is, a lot of the framing around this issue often comes at it from post-secondary teaching is superior to high school teaching, and what we need to do as part of this is make high school teachers act and look more like post-secondary faculty, and that being therefore, X plus Y equals Z, right? And Z being higher quality teaching. When in reality, we know that there's a massive amount of value. Like we all had terrible professors in college, right? Like, and we all had absolutely excellent high school teachers who probably could run rings around some of those really bad college professors that we all had in our post-secondary experiences, whatever and wherever that may have been. And I think the dual, like this space within which we're bringing together secondary and post-secondary has started to create a level of discussion and conversation around, okay, well, again, this is right. This is the key challenge in the work that we work on all the time, which is that secondary speaks one language, it's called English, and post-secondary speaks another language, it's also called English. You guys, I mean, many of you know I'm British originally, so I get it from the British English and the American English side of things, right? Like we are divided by a common language, and I think this sort of dual enrollment space does create an opening for a lot of longer term discussions around like, okay, but what does it really mean to kind of blend the best of K-12 instruction and the best of post-secondary instruction together to be most effective for students, right? Because ultimately that's what we're trying to do, is create experiences for students that will allow them to succeed, will allow them to have interesting, authentic college and high school experiences that will catapult them into some kind of post-secondary experience that will catapult them into a productive, well-paying, enriching career that they feel really good about. And so there is this sort of space, I think, within which some of those conversations are starting to happen. But, because this is two systems that have functioned the way they function for hundreds of years at this point, it's going to continue to take a lot of hard work and a lot of kind of guts in order to sort of start thinking about that. And again, to come back to that research piece, I think that's why I think there's a really interesting angle here for the research community going forward around that question of like, what is ultimately most effective for students? Because in this kind of, particularly in the teacher credentialing space, it's easy for us to be one or two steps removed from the primary audience that we really need to be considerate about, which is the student experience in these programs and how well the work that we're doing is ultimately serving students. Because a lot of the teacher credentialing conversations are kind of held at the system level. And when we're at the system level, we're automatically a bit removed from the student perspective. And so I think, more research is really necessary in order to unpack what does it mean, what does it mean from an instruction side for students to be successful in these courses? What is successful instruction look like? And how does successful instruction ultimately kind of accelerate, sorry, I hate using that term, advance students through these programs and set them up for that level of success in college and career. And so I think what surprised me was the willingness that there was amongst the working group members, and certainly in the chat, we've seen a lively discussion about this in the Q&A, to start having those conversations. And I think there's actually quite a large research agenda at this point to sort of really kind of unpick those questions about what it ultimately means to have students learn effectively in these programs to add to their success.
Thanks, Alex. And so we have just a few minutes left. Amy, I know that you have kind of a CTE background, including a state role in Montana. Can you talk about, we've mostly been talking about graduate courses, but can you talk about CTE teachers and the unique challenges and opportunities there?
Yeah, I'll do a couple quick touch points just because, we did intentionally go down that road in the paper and really wanted to make sure that we were attending. This is not just a credentialing kind of crisis on the gen ed side, although that's the one that's most prominent. CTE instructors, especially in more technical and hands-on fields, are either hard to find or retiring at high rates. So when we look at the CTE space, there's a lot more flexibility in regional accreditors policy, and that really recognizes and echoes the importance of, staying connected, career connected, staying current on what current and emerging technologies are of value in business and industry, and helping give students really a broader lens of a potential career field through these experience in these courses. So when we talk about CTE opportunities for teachers, and I was a former state director, so we worked really consciously on identifying areas where we needed more workforce support and more students entering and completing through some sort of degree or credential or training program. And so I think there are some great flexibilities. Perkins provides really nice flexibility in terms of prioritizing and in funding as well to do things like bring business and industry together to talk about, with high school instructors and colleges, to talk about things like getting teachers externships so that they can get some work hour experiences in business and industry, helping provide credentials or licensure or training or certificates that have value in the business and industry, fine tuning and updating some skills. They might have learned a lot about, like AutoCAD or something, but now everybody is using Revit. So those kind of things, little boot camp opportunities, specialized trainings, summer workshops, those kind of things are really an awesome opportunity to really be intentional about what you're building for CTE teachers to help prepare them, but also how that ports out eventually into the local and community workforce areas.
Thanks, Amy. Great points. So just a few minutes left. I want to give each of our panelists a minute to do a really quick, what can I do from the practitioner perspective, the policy perspective, state agency perspective. Jenny, let's start with you.
Well, I invite folks in the Midwestern states, the 12 states that MEC represents, and not just represents, but are our members. You can go to www.mhec.org and see which those states are. And you can also then just sign up for a number of things on that website, not the least of which is a concurrent enrollment newsletter, which for those of you who have signed up for that, that we took a pause this last year as we worked on this work and graduate credit quest, but we're going to be resurrecting that this year and getting some more information out to you. Take a look at Graduate Credit Quest. Again, that's going to be a place where we're going to put as much information as we can and try to bring in the voices of folks who have some specific issues they're grappling with in this area. And go ahead, if you're in our states, and that's for everybody, but in our states, you can also join one of the work groups that we're going to be putting together. A couple of years ago, we had some really great advisory and working groups for this issue. And so we're going to be reconvening those. So be looking out for the call for those. And, share this information, share the link to GCQ, to the paper, to NACEP, to College and the High School Alliance, and to Pathway to 18. Just help make people more aware of the resources that are out there, because I do find that's still the most effective way, no matter how many people I can put on an email campaign or on a list server. Sure as shooting, if someone knows something, it's, oh yeah, well, so-and-so told me. So just please be good ambassadors for this information and for this work.
I'd say, if you have the time, read the paper. Would certainly be plug number one. But plug number two would be, this obviously represented a year's worth of work for us to get to kind of the place that we're at right now. We won't claim to know everything yet. And always interested in learning more about innovative approaches that folks have. There've been some that have been highlighted in the chat, which of course we'd be interested in learning more about. And then two, reach out, right? If you're in the MEC region, reach out to Jenny. If you're a state policymaker interested or a system level person interested in these issues, by all means, reach out to me. If you're any of the above and a practitioner, by all means, reach out to Amy. And we're always interested in having conversations about trying to think about how to help you solve the challenges that you're facing. You're not in this alone. There's lots of other people who are facing the same challenges. I know in a lot of our work, it can feel quite isolated because we do live in this sort of liminal space between secondary and post-secondary, and it's sort of like, I'm the only person at my college or at my high school who does this specific work. But please know there is a wider community of people you can get access to. We're available to folks to talk to them or connect you with other folks who are in the field. So please feel free to reach out and continue this conversation with us. We'd be really thrilled to do so.
Yeah, and I will shamelessly add that, if you want to hear conversations about this, we are going to be in Minnesota, where they have done a lot of progressive work in this space. We're going to be there for our national conference. That would be an outstanding opportunity to tap into that network that Alex mentioned, those folks that, other people that speak your language, understand your challenges, and can share along with that. And I would also endorse reading the paper and then putting yourself in the mental context of like, what is my situation and what are the levers that I have under my control. And then if I don't feel like I have anything under control, start reaching out and looking to others to connect with, to try and build that coalition to speak a little more loudly with a combined voice.
Thanks. And I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank you all. Yeah, and to echo what we've heard, once you've looked at the report, please let us know if there are issues covered here that you'd like MEC, College and High School Alliance, or NACEP to provide deeper context or analysis on or support. And we'll also, shameless plug, we'll also be at the HLC meeting in Chicago in April. We'd love to continue the conversation with you all if any of you are planning to attend. So thank you so much.